Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this early hour. So I'm going to see if I can read from my screen and at the same time manage the slides as well. So thank you. First of all, let me please thank the conference organizers for having us here. This is my first ecological economics conference, and it's a real treat to be there, so thank you very much. And what I will do in this talk, and I will give a mostly a little bit critical, but also somewhat optimistic, and I'll let you be the judge of whether I actually succeed in that, account of this concept of ecosystem services, of what it's been doing, of how it's shaped actually the structure of biodiversity knowledge making, as well as biodiversity governance. And I will do so by focusing on the politics of knowledge, and particularly on the notion of order. So order and orderings have been theorized in political theory, in science and technology studies, and in other disciplines, amongst others in the book covers that I wanted to show here. These different works all show how classification systems work to put people, things, and nature in territories into their respective boxes, and such classifications facilitate control. Now, the example of scientific forestry in James Scott's Seeing Like a State is a memorable illustration of this. It shows how knowledge that was produced to make the forest legible and optimize timber harvest ended up actually creating the forest in its own image. The Normalbaum, as he writes about it, which was a theoretical abstraction that were used to simulate and model tree growth, had become reality. The example demonstrates that knowledge, in the form of classifications, is performative. And one reason for this is because the definitions of categories are not just neutral descriptions, but work as ideals. Now, within taxonomy, the classification of plants and animals, each of these categories is defined not just through identification keys, but also through so-called type specimen, which are stored in natural history museums throughout the world. This is the type specimen of a specific robber fly species. It is the archetypical or normal robber fly. Now, I use this example to make a more general point, that definitions also, or perhaps particularly so, in science are normative. Definitions define the normal, and this can be used subsequently as a normative yardstick against which to evaluate actually existing plants, animals, or people. And through this process, the classification systems get normalized, and the categories it is made of are increasingly seen as the items that nature or reality really consists of. Now, this is not because the classifications represent nature so well. The apparent realness of classifications is the result of performativity. Items or people that do not fit are easily overlooked or denied existence. And to mitigate the effects of such marginalization, people also self-discipline, and they assume, at least partially, the subject positions that have been afforded to them by the classification systems. Now, biodiversity science is a useful illustration of this desire to order. There's an ongoing attempt to identify and classify all remaining species on Earth, so that at least we might put their records in databases before they become extinct. But the classification of biodiversity is not stable, and as a result of this, biodiversity itself is not stable. Ranging from Linnaeus and DNA barcoding, numerous different classification systems for biodiversity have been suggested, and each of these offers new definitions of what it is that makes a species, including different categories and relations of kinship. Thus, throughout the years, biodiversity has been known differently, or put more accurately, it has been known to be different. When we go to conservation and conservation policy, we see similar dynamics in the representation of biodiversity. Here, categorizations emerge that are explicitly meant to be policy relevant. They inform decision-making about what to conserve, where to do this, and how. This one, for example, the IUCN Red List, groups species according to the degree of threatenedness. And here we have a second example, a map of the biodiversity hotspots identified by Conservation International. Now, both the Red List and the hotspots are attempts to represent what is important about biodiversity on a global level in order to steer political action. And while these are mostly based on natural sciences, this is now, in my view, starting to change. This is a picture you are all probably extremely familiar with. Now, the introduction of the concept of ecosystem services in the Millennium Assessment was an important step towards the representation of biodiversity in a more interdisciplinary way. It is clear that knowledge to fit these boxes can no longer come only from the natural sciences, and that actually the social sciences are important to fill some of these boxes about how the various elements of human well-being are affected by changes in ecosystems. Many conservationists and scientists as well have enthusiastically embraced the concept because it was hoped that finally this would make biodiversity knowledge relevant for decision making and finally stimulate effective action on the ground. Whether this is in fact the case is actually an open question, since not all policymakers and practitioners are actually so excited about the concept, but that's a different discussion. Nevertheless, the expectation or the hope of relevance has triggered a flurry of different scientific and research activities. Now, the concept, as you all know, has also received strong criticism. These criticisms have been informed by exactly the same reasons that have led so many others to be excited about it. Its supposed appeal to policy and economic elites. These critics focus mostly on the term service and its strong economic and utilitarian associations. The concept could be interpreted to suggest that only useful nature has to be protected and that it's reasonable to expect nature to pay for its own protection. Apart from these criticisms, mostly from political ecology, the work by Morgan Robertson highlights the role of science and the ontological politics of the concept of ecosystem services. His suggestion, in line with my earlier comments about the performativity of knowledge, is that with the increasing uptake of the concept of ecosystem services and the increasing circulation of standardized metrics which measure, and in the case of wetland mitigation banking, about which he writes, also monetize ecosystem services, we are quite literally living in and with a new nature, one that is increasingly seen to be really made up of ecosystem services. Now, there are many good reasons to view these developments with great caution. Among the most well-known payment for ecosystem services schemes is the REDD+ program, which aims to reduce carbon emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. This idea has triggered not just complicated negotiations in the UNFCCC, but also a set of measurement and calculative technologies. This image was created by a LiDAR, a radar with light instead of radio waves. It can create a point cloud, which you can use to model individual trees, like the pink one. Then a series of calculations can be applied to assess the carbon content of that specific tree, the CO2 emissions that have been avoided by not logging it, and the financial benefits that this could bring should these credits be traded on a market. Now, in this line of reasoning, this is not just a forest, it's also a carbon sink. But if carbon content of forest becomes the main bearer of value in red, it may end up incentivizing strategies to optimize this specific measure. So in theory then, this palm oil plantation could also be a forest and be eligible for result-based payments in RED+. So, and this is something we all know too well in our performance-based university systems, specific performance indicators which have been derived from reductionist forms of knowledge have the tendency to replace what they're supposed to signify, often with unintended and unanticipated consequences. Now, for these reasons, I've been following the process of creating an IPBES with great interest, with some healthy skepticism, but also with some optimism. IPBES is a new UN body, which you probably also, most of you know, that aims to play a comparable role as the IPCC for climate by offering scientific assessments that will inform policymakers. In the terms of yesterday's keynote, IPBES is an SPI. So my research, a couple of years ago already, has shown that in IPBES, the concept of ecosystem services plays a particular role. It has become part of what I call a measurementality logic. And this measurementality logic is the result of a combination of a technocratic conception of the relation between science and policy, which holds that science can provide neutral input for policy and that decisions must be based on sound science. Second, we have managerial discourse that suggests that for science to play such a role, we need efficient and well-managed SPIs. And thirdly, a discourse of policy relevance, and this discourse currently promotes ecosystem services as the preferred policy relevant category to package knowledge in. Now, when you put them together, like is done in IPBES, at least in its formal documentation, you get a self-referential system which privileges science-based techniques, which to ensure efficiency and relevance should focus exclusively on the representation of nature as ecosystem services. Now, this is not only not a very diverse way of representing the diversity of life, it also reveals a problematic circularity in the relation between knowledge and governance, where ecosystem services science constitutes the objects of global biodiversity governance, and where biodiversity governance in turn requires ever more scientific information about these objects in order to govern them effectively. Now, this is a familiar argument probably for quite a few of you, but as I have come to realize, it's not the only story about IPBES or about the concept of ecosystem services, because IPBES is also this. This is the official conceptual framework of IPBES, and it has to be reflected in all its activities and products. The idea of this framework is that it enables conversations between different worldviews, where the green elements represent Western science and the blue ones represent their counterparts in ILK language. Now, in my view, this conceptual framework reflects a serious commitment to be inclusive of different values and knowledge systems. And in doing so, it opens up possibilities to reimagine what global biodiversity knowledge making should look like. But whether it will in the end accomplish this is an open question. But there are some promising initial signs. The first sign is the constant contestation that takes place in the ecosystem services community. These contestations concern not so much the usefulness of the concept, but pretty much everything else. There are disagreements over what services actually are and how they can be distinguished from benefits. Which of these should actually be the bearer of value? What types of value should be attributed, whether these should be numerical or monetary or something else altogether, and about how value can be calculated through models, economics, or deliberation. This is only one of the many alternative conceptual frameworks that are being proposed and debated in literature. So I draw two conclusions from this. First of all, the concept of ecosystem services is basically a bit of a mess. And second, the ecosystem services community is vibrant, lively, and to varying extents exclusive of different ideas and viewpoints. Now, I want to say to varying extent here because there are surely some who would like to see this mess sorted out, who would like to see a singular definition, or at least, if that's not possible, a taxonomy that offers an orderly categorization of ES definitions and approaches. However, for me, this messiness is a reason to be hopeful and optimistic about what this concept might do. It demonstrates that actually the concept of ecosystem services against the fears by Morgan Robertson and other critics has not actually become normalized, and that its effects have been contingent and diverse. It has not yet, at least, fulfilled the three main functions of a successful representative sign. It does not offer an accepted and coherent system of order. There are no clear methodologies and techniques for designation, and the values attributed to them are not fully commensurated, thereby preventing circulation and exchange. Now, for IPBES, such diversity is important as a reflection of its core values and pluralism and inclusiveness, but it's also a problem. Because how can an organization, which much like the IPCC, has as its mandate to produce assessments that reflect the scientific consensus view, deal with this diversity? As explained in a recent paper by Jesper Montana, the preferred way for IPBES to do this, to navigate this dilemma, is through the production of categories. Through these categorizations, diversity is defined and structured. And if all boxes are filled, IPBES can claim to be inclusive and diverse. But obviously, it has in doing so also tamed this diversity. So as Montana points out, the production of typologies in IPBES is as much a reflection of its struggle to be inclusive and to be diverse as it is a reflection of a strong discourse of pragmatism, the importance of getting things done. So my own observations as an observer and a participant in IPBES confirm this. Indeed, as a lead author in the Global Biodiversity Assessment, okay, I think I'll manage. I'm witness to the increasing proliferation of typologies that are intended to further define each of the categories in the conceptual framework. I also witness as well as contribute to the ongoing struggle of making sense of what is expected from IPBES and what this global assessment will ultimately look like. Now, there's a real possibility that in the end, pragmatic logics will take over because the assessment will need to get done. Those experts with experience with modeling and scenario analysis, often from the IPCC or the Millennium Assessment, may then be put in a position of power because they know how to do assessments. But despite this, the categories of the conceptual framework are here to stay. So perhaps this means that also these experts, perhaps in a similar spirit of pragmatism, will accept that an IPBES assessment cannot resemble an IPCC assessment, and that as a result it may not carry the same epistemic power and ability to offer a singular definition of the problem, like the IPCC has managed to do for climate change. Now, for me, this is good news. It is good news for the democratization of biodiversity knowledge. Biodiversity is moving away from being framed solely as a technocratic issue that can be tackled through what Jessenhoff has called technologies of hubris. It is repoliticized, and a space is being created at the global level for what Chantal Mouffe calls the political, and which is important for democracy to flourish. The current unfixity of the categories that are offered to classify biodiversity and ecosystem services, the diversity of definitions and methods and approaches, and the continuous negotiations over who knows about biodiversity all suggest that in IPBES, biodiversity assessment could be a technology of humility and could contribute positively to the democratization of knowledge. In that sense, and this is my conclusion, both IPBES and the ES community could be seen as a test case for the democratization of science on a global level, but only, in my view, if they continue to offer space for politicization of knowledge, for resisting technocratic closure, and for fostering humility, accountability, and contestation. Thank you.